October 10th, 1991. It's a cool night in Waco, Texas. Police watch as a truck approaches their checkpoint before suddenly pulling over and stopping 50 feet away. Little do the police know, but they are now part of a nightmare that will change Texas forever. A curious officer walks towards the truck to investigate, but as he does, the windshield of the truck begins to shatter, break, and burst outward. Someone was kicking it from inside the car. As the kicks continue, the truck roars and races forward toward the police. 3 officers dive out the way, but not before seeing the cause of the broken windshield. A woman in the passenger seat with her hands bound behind her back, screaming and fighting desperately for her life, trying to escape from whoever was driving in the car. And as the police leapt into their cars and gave chase, the driver, whoever he was, vanished into the black Texas night, taking the woman with him who would never be seen alive again. This is the story of Kenneth McDuff, the Broomstick Killer, the only man to be sentenced to death twice by 2 different forms of execution. This is the story of a brutal killer and the multi-generational hunt to bring him to justice. Evil often has telltale signs, clues to its origins, but sometimes it emerges fully formed. This is how it was for Kenneth McDuff. He was born on March the 21st, 1946, and grew up in Rosebud, Central Texas in a large family. His father was John Allen J.A. McDuff, owner of a successful concrete business. His mother was Addie McDuff, whose violent proclivities earned her a unique nickname. When a bus driver threatened to throw her son off the bus, Addie pulled a gun and urged him at gunpoint to reconsider. And from then on, people called her the pistol-packing mama. At Rosebud High School, Kenneth McDuff quickly established himself as a bully who took pleasure in preying on the weak. But like all bullies, his predatory nature concealed a cowardly heart. McDuff was relatively big, but he picked his targets carefully. Early on, a fight with a popular athlete named Tommy Salmons ended in humiliation for McDuff. So like most cowards, he resolved to only prey on the kids smaller and weaker than himself, but fortunately for his peers, his school career wasn't to last. He soon quit and began work as a manual laborer at his father's concrete business. It wasn't long before he earned a reputation as a braggart, claiming old ladies loved how he mowed their lawns, making his colleagues jealous. McDuff's habit of fighting older boys and shooting his .22 caliber rifle at animals also gained him the attention of the local sheriff. Small misdemeanors at the time, but if only the police knew how much McDuff's hunger for crime was growing. In 1964, when he was 18 years old, McDuff was convicted of 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary. He had committed the crimes across Bell County, Falls County, and Milano County. He was sentenced to 12 4-year terms that he would serve concurrently, but it wouldn't be long before he was released. In December 1965, McDuff was granted parole, and it didn't take him long to return to his ways. He quickly got into fights, made terroristic threats to African Americans, and was even briefly returned to prison before being re-released. And it was here that McDuff's path towards darkness hit its stride. In August 1966, he was working away and pouring concrete with his new friend, Roy Dale Green. McDuff had bragged about his criminal record and even claimed to have raped and killed 2 young women. He told Green, "Killing a woman's like killing a chicken. They both squawk." That night, McDuff and Green were driving around Texas, and to Green, it seemed a bit aimless, so he questioned McDuff, who said coldly that he was looking for a girl. At 10 p.m., he found one. A lone car was parked near a baseball diamond in Everman, Texas. Inside were 2 teenage boys and a teenage girl, Robert Brand, Marcus Dunham, and Edna Louise Sullivan. McDuff and Green parked nearby and approached the trio, before Kenneth revealed his .38 Colt revolver and began threatening them. He ordered them into the trunk of their Ford, then drove off, with Green following behind in his car. Eventually, they reached a field, and McDuff told Green to put the girl, Sullivan, in the trunk of his Dodge. Then, with the 2 teenage boys still in the trunk of their car, McDuff told Green he'd have to knock them off. The boys begged for their lives, and McDuff proceeded to shoot them in the head 5 times, killing them. After Green wiped the fingerprints off the Ford, the 2 men drove Sullivan to another location and returned multiple times. When they were done, McDuff asked for something to strangle her with. Green gave him his belt, but he decided against it and strangled her with a 3-foot-long piece of broomstick that he'd retrieved from his car. With their crime completed, the murderers disposed of her body in some bushes, brought some Coca-Cola, and then went for a sleepover at Green's house. From these blaze actions, it seemed the murder barely left a mark on either man's conscience. But this couldn't be more wrong. The next day, Green listened in horror as the murder was announced on the radio, while McDuff began to cover his tracks. He buried his gun next to Green's garage and washed his car at the house of mutual friend Richard Boyd. But throughout, Green's guilt began to swell and torment him, and he soon confessed his crimes to Boyd's parents. They quickly relayed the confession to Green's mother, who compelled her son to confess to the police. And he did. Albert Brady, a Falls County sheriff and World War II veteran, arrived on the scene, accompanied by Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Parnell McNamara Sr. They arrested McDuff and Green, and I want you to take note of these names because they're important for later. In questioning, Green alleged that he had raped Sullivan under duress, meaning McDuff had threatened or forced him. He agreed to testify against McDuff in exchange for a lesser sentence, and so he received 25 years, which was a much lighter sentence than McDuff, who was sentenced to death by electric chair. So Kenneth is a cold-blooded killer, a rapist, and a 12-time thief, and now it's time for him to pay the price of death for his crimes. Except fate had other plans. In 1972, the death penalty was deemed unconstitutional, and McDuff's death sentence was overturned. He hired a lawyer and claimed Green was behind the killings, and all the while, forces surrounding the Texas prison system seemed to be moving in his favor. Texas prisons had grown extremely overcrowded, with far too many inmates per penitentiary. A federal judge took notice and deemed the overcrowding unconstitutional, meaning something had to be done and many prisoners would have to be paroled. McDuff had a chance and was brought before the parole board, and impressed by his claims about Green, they actually considered his case and were on the verge of granting parole. But soon they received concerning news. In a one-on-one interview, McDuff had attempted to bribe a board member to secure his parole. His attempt blew up in his face and landed him with a 2-year sentence for attempted bribery, another crime added to his already extensive list. But while this should be the end of his story, it's not. The board members thought, and they must have been high on something, they thought McDuff could still contribute to society. And with that decision, no doubt influenced by the prison overcrowding, McDuff was paroled in 1989. But little did the board members know how terrible his contributions to society would become because of the 20 former death row inmates and 127 murderers that were released during this time. Out of all of them, Kenneth McDuff would prove to be the most depraved. Almost immediately, his true character revealed itself. While he was working at a gas station making $4 an hour, he made violent threats, picked fights, got a DUI, and drank heavily. It wasn't long before he became addicted to crack cocaine, but these incidents would prove to be minor compared to his next act. It is believed that within 3 days of release, McDuff had started killing again. Just 3 days. That's all he managed. On October the 14th, 1989, the body of a 29-year-old woman was discovered. She had been beaten, strangled to death, and dumped in a field in Temple, Texas, 48 miles south of Waco. Was McDuff the killer? Had his murderous lust patiently waited this long to be satiated? Could a man be so inherently violent that he'd kill immediately upon being released from life sentence in prison? Well, McDuff was never charged with this crime, but to this day, he is highly suspected to be the killer. Death threats to an African-American teenager soon landed McDuff back in jail, but his mother, Addie, spent over $2,000 to evaluate her son's prospects of release, and a week before Christmas of 1990, McDuff was re-released. He would prove to be the gift that Texas never wanted. A little less than a year later, he returned to his murderous ways. As night fell on October the 10th, 1991, McDuff kidnapped sex worker Brenda Thompson and tied her hands behind her back. She was the same woman seen at the police checkpoint, desperately screaming and kicking the windshield of McDuff's truck. With the police chasing behind, McDuff turned off his lights and vanished down one-way streets. He made his way to a forest near US Route 84 and proceeded to cruelly torture and kill Brenda. It would be 7 years until her body was discovered, but he didn't stop there. On October the 15th, 1991, McDuff was seen arguing with Regina Deanne Moore at a Waco hotel. Regina was a 21-year-old prostitute. They soon drove off together, and McDuff took her to a remote area next to Texas State Highway 6. There, he bound her arms and legs with stockings and killed her. As with Brenda Thompson, Regina's body wasn't discovered for 7 years, and she was listed as missing from home the entire time. Around this time, another murder is believed to have been committed. 23-year-old Cynthia Reese Gonzalez was reported missing in September of 1991. Less than a week later, her body was found in a forest near I-35. Fast forward a few months to December 29th, 1991, and he killed again. But this time, McDuff had an accomplice, a man named Alva Hank Worley. Like McDuff's previous accomplice Green, Worley claimed McDuff said he was going to take a girl that night. And he did. Her name was Colleen Reed from Louisiana. She was kidnapped from an Austin car wash in plain sight. Reed pleaded with them, but they took turns raping her. McDuff in particular tied her hands behind her back, assaulted her over the hood of her car, beat her and burnt her with cigarettes. In Worley's account, McDuff said he was going to use her up and get rid of her. McDuff kept his word. On February the 24th, 1992, prostitute Valencia Joshua was seen knocking on Kenneth McDuff's door. This was the last time she was seen alive. McDuff strangled her to death on a golf course, and her body was discovered a few weeks later. On March the 1st, 1992, Kenneth McDuff found his next victim, a 22-year-old clerk named Melissa Northrup, who was working at the local Quick Pack. He had worked together with her at the store. She had 2 children. She was a dutiful mother and was pregnant with her 3rd, but that day she disappeared. McDuff quickly became a suspect for 2 reasons. The first was that he was seen near the Quick Pack at the time of her disappearance. The second was that a college friend told police McDuff had tried to enlist his help in robbing the store. Melissa's car was also found abandoned near Segoville 5 days later, but there was no sign of her or McDuff. It wasn't until April 26th that her body was discovered by a fisherman. Like many of McDuff's victims, she had been strangled to death. By now, McDuff was a key suspect in multiple murders. However, the investigation encountered difficulties because his murders took place all across Texas, and they're spread out across many counties. So coordinating an investigation proved problematic, but there was a solution. A federal offense would put the investigation under the jurisdiction of larger institutions like the FBI. And luckily for them, McDuff had an illegal firearm and was known to be selling drugs. That's 2 federal offenses, so a warrant was soon issued for his arrest, but McDuff was nowhere to be found. Desperate for a lead, Bell County investigators sought out a known associate of McDuff's. They found Alva Hank Worley, his accomplice in Colleen Reed's murder. He soon admitted his involvement in the kidnapping, but denied any involvement in the killing. As for the killer himself, McDuff, he was gone, and even Worley couldn't help the authorities find him. But they would soon get a lead from an unexpected source 600 miles away. On May the 1st in Kansas City, Missouri, Gary Smithy was watching America's Most Wanted when he experienced something strange. On the screen, listed as a wanted criminal, was a man he recognized. The criminal was named Kenneth McDuff, but Smithy knew him as Richard Fowler, his colleague at the refuse center. He couldn't believe his eyes. Were they the same man? Shocked, Gary soon contacted Kansas City police. A background search revealed that Richard Fowler had been arrested and fingerprinted for trying to solicit prostitutes. And those fingerprints were an exact match with McDuff. He had fled Texas with a new car and fake ID, and 3 days later, 6 officers arrested McDuff south of Kansas City. And now is perhaps the most baffling part of the whole story. Among the officers who arrested McDuff were Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Parnell McNamara Jr., his brother, Deputy U.S. Marshal Mike McNamara, and Falls County Sheriff Larry Pamplin, the sons of the 2 men who had arrested McDuff for his triple murder back in 1966. So Kenneth was brought to justice twice and forced to face the death penalty twice by the same families, fathers and sons, capturing the same killer decades apart. McDuff was indicted for the murder of Northrup on June the 26th, 1992. He was a large man, 6'3", 255 pounds, with a sinister smile and an education level of a child. And he was not a compliant defendant. He claimed Worley's confession was a lie. He claimed he'd only wanted to rob big-time drug dealers while Worley had wanted to kidnap women. McDuff had told him no, and this was the same attempted lie he used with Roy Dale Green. At his arraignment, the largest security ever seen in the history of Waco was assembled. This was to protect McDuff from the large and angry crowds that swelled outside, many of which were the families of his victims. During his trials, he was rude and disruptive. He tried to represent himself and frequently lied. He complained that federal marshals were pressuring his accomplices and that the news media was spinning stories and that there was insufficient evidence to convict him. Oh, how Kenneth was wrong. Because on February the 18th, 1993, McDuff was found guilty of Melissa Northrop's murder and sentenced to death. He would be executed by lethal injection. 2 sentences, by 3 separate juries, decades apart, death by electric chair, and now by lethal injection. And as his date of execution neared, he provided the locations of Regina Moore, Brenda Thompson, and Colleen Reed's bodies, the latter of which he led authorities to in person under strict security. It would be one of his last experiences of freedom. McDuff was executed in Huntsville on November the 17th, 1998. His final words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." Then he gasped multiple times, exhaled, and fell unconscious. 8 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Brenda Solomon, the mother of Melissa Ann Northrop, watched him die. She said he looked like the devil. Kenneth McDuff's family did not claim his remains, and he is buried in Peckerwood Hill under a headstone with his date of execution, his death row number, and an X, meaning the state of Texas executed him. Kenneth McDuff's story is a chilling reminder of the flaws and challenges within the justice system. So his crimes obviously devastated countless lives, but they also led to significant changes in parole laws and the monitoring of violent offenders. His legacy, though dark, serves as a critical lesson in the importance of vigilance and justice.